Right now, we're in the middle of a serious storm in the property market. And whether you're a landlord or a tenant, it's about to get a whole lot worse. If you don't have the right knowledge. Make sure you stick around to the end of the video to find out exactly how you can not only weather this storm, but turn it into the opportunity of a lifetime. Welcome back to the Progressive Property YouTube channel. I'm Sean Fitzpatrick, and in this episode, we're going to be exploring why the rental market has gone so crazy over the last few years. Since 2010, rental prices have shot up by 90% across the country. This is totally unprecedented, and we're going to be deep diving into the reasons why it has been happening. We are going to start back in 2015 when they introduced Section 24 tax changes. So Section 24 tax changes were announced by the Conservative government back in 2015 under George Osborne. It came into effect in 2017 and came into full force by 2020. Section 24 basically means that normal landlords who own properties in their personal name can no longer offset mortgage interest as a tax-deductible expense. Now, it only affected landlords who own properties in their personal names. So it didn't affect the huge corporate landlords who own hundreds and hundreds of properties. It affected the small landlord who has maybe one or two properties as a retirement plan. It affected the landlord who cared about their tenants, who wanted to make sure their properties were kept in good condition for their tenants because they had a retirement plan and they wanted to keep their properties in tip-top condition. So this was a tax on the small landlord, not the big corporate landlords. And this is the impact that it had on rents. So we are going to talk about a landlord, James, and this is what the numbers of his property look like. So he owns a buy-to-let with a mortgage of £200,000 with an interest rate of 5%. That means he pays an annual mortgage interest of £10,000. He can get a monthly rent of £1,250 from his tenant, which means he has an annual rental income of £15,000 per year. Now, he's a good landlord, he wants to look after his tenants, so he maintains his property. And so some costs that he has to pay for maintenance, repairs and management maybe cost him about £2,000 per year. So his rent coming in is £15,000, minus the mortgage interest of £10,000, minus expenses, means that he has a real profit of £2,000 for his property. So how does Section 24 impact James's rental income? Section 24 meant that mortgage interest was no longer deductible. So his taxable income is now £15,000 minus £2,000 expenses, which means his total taxable income is £13,000. He gets taxed at his normal rate of 40%, which means he's paying £5,200 in tax. He does get a tax credit of 20% on the interest, which means he has a tax credit of £2,000. That means his total tax payable equals £3,200. Now here's James's problem. He now has a real profit of £3,000, but he has to pay £3,200 in tax. So he is now losing £200 a year on this property, which before Section 24 came in, he was making a £3,000 profit. So this is completely insane. James is no longer making any profit, but paying more tax than he was before Section 24. And this happened to private landlords all across the country who owned properties in their personal names, people who wanted the property for their pension. Now, James is a landlord who was looking after his tenant. He kept the rent slightly below market rent because he wanted to give them a fair deal. But in order to make a profit now, he has to put his rents up. And that's exactly what started to happen. So as you can see in this situation, it wasn't James's fault that the rents had to increase. Government legislation put him between a rock and a hard place. And if he has a choice between putting his rents up or selling his property, that's a very challenging choice to make. But here's the thing. If he chose to sell his property, a new landlord would come in and they would probably evict the tenant or put the tenant's rent up anyway. So the only real choice James had was to keep the property and put the rents up to offset the tax balance that the government is now stealing out of his pocket. So we're going to get back to the video in just a moment, but first, you may have heard of our new global online education platform, Property.school. And this is your one-stop shop for everything property investing. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned professional, Property.school has hundreds of hours of masterclasses for everyone. And don't forget, as a member of Property.school, you get 10% off all progressive training courses. So grab your place today, become a Property.school member now by clicking the link in the comments and start to change your life. Now, back to the video. And things only got worse when the government introduced new legislation against agents, namely the tenant fee ban. So the tenant fee ban came in 2019. Letting agents, how they made their income pre-2019 was they would charge tenants a fee for finding them a property, they would charge landlords a fee for finding them a tenant, and they would charge management fees if they continued to manage that property. However, in 2019, in order to protect tenants, new legislation was introduced that banned agents from taking fees from tenants. Letting agents all of a sudden lost a huge amount of revenue. How did the agents make up that loss? They charged the landlords more for the tenant find fee for the landlord. So landlords now had to pay more to find tenants for their properties. How do landlords cover the cost of finding these tenants? A landlord could pay up to £500 to an agent just to find one tenant. If they've got a HMO with 6 tenants to find, that's a pretty hefty bill. The landlord, in order to cover those costs and not make a loss, has to increase the rents on the tenants that are coming in to cover that cost. So again, the government coming in to try to help the tenant actually forces rents even higher still. And it gets worse. So around the same time as the tenant fee ban was coming in, a storm was brewing that would eventually mean that we couldn't leave our homes. Now, lots happened over that period of time which forced rents up. Number one, maintenance costs. People were spending more time in their houses. And with people spending more time in their houses, there was more wear and tear happening. And landlords were still expected to foot the bill for maintenance and repairs. So the maintenance and repair bills went up. But not only did they go up, the actual cost of materials for those repairs and the cost of labour also increased. So the burden, the financial burden on the landlords increased through no fault of the tenants and no fault of the landlords. It was the fault of the situation that was happening at that particular moment in time. When the landlords realised this is actually costing us a lot of money, rents ended up being pushed up higher and higher again because landlords had to cover their costs. Now, people say that the government want property prices to decrease. This period of time where people couldn't leave their homes, where the market was static for the most part, was the perfect time to let the market crash if they wanted prices to go down. But they didn't. What instead they did was they put an artificial stamp duty holiday in place to keep the market buoyant and to keep prices high. Now, there's one other aspect that we haven't talked about so far, and that's the aspect of supply versus demand. So supply and demand is one of the biggest drivers of costs in any market, and that includes the property market. So with Section 24 coming in, lots of landlords ended up selling their properties. During the period of time where we couldn't leave our houses, people had to spend time together. A lot of couples who'd been together for a long time actually ended up breaking up. Right? 2 people who were cohabiting, a lot of them all of a sudden, one of them left the property. Or both of them left one property. And we needed more supply. Demand had increased, but supply had not. And when you have a situation where demand increases, but supply stays the same or decreases, where there's more demand, prices get pushed up because there's more competition for properties. And that's how it works in any market. So you couple that with the inflation and maintenance costs, the supply and demand issues that were created, rents started to increase even further. And then we had Liz Truss and her mini budget. So Liz Truss, who wasn't elected by any of us during her 49-day premiership, completely changed the property market. She had her mini budget in September 2022. and the market went into turmoil. The Bank of England base rate went from 0.5% to 5.25% in under 2 years. And this forced mortgage interest rates up. So a lot of landlords were locked into low interest rate deals on their mortgages. And as the landlords start coming off their low interest rate mortgage deals, their interest payments skyrocketed. Now, the effect of this was pretty much overnight, because a lot of landlords were in blissful ignorance about this until they come off their fixed rate mortgages. And pretty much overnight, the amount of interest they were paying on their mortgage for some people doubled. Now, there are some really, really lovely landlords out there who want to keep the rents low for tenants, right? And some who bring them up to market level. But in either case, a huge interest hike like that on landlords leaves them out of pocket. So the net impact of that is that landlords were stuck in this situation again about deciding, do they sell their property or do they increase the rents? Or move into the serviced accommodation space and take their properties out of the rental stock altogether. Have we seen those news stories about unscrupulous landlords pushing rents up by massive amounts on unsuspecting tenants? In many cases, it was the fact that the landlord was keeping their rents way low, below the market value rent, because they wanted to be helpful to their tenants. And then all of a sudden they found themselves in a position where they couldn't afford to pay their interest payments. And they had no choice but to increase the rents. And for some people who'd been on low rents for years, the landlord had to potentially increase that rent to market immediately. And what that meant for tenants was some tenants had massive increases really quickly. And then the news stories come out that these unscrupulous landlords are taking advantage of these tenants by putting rents up, when the reality is these tenants were below market rent for years and had saved potentially thousands and thousands of pounds. And all the landlord was doing was bringing their properties up to the market level because they no longer had a choice, because their mortgage interest rates had just gone through the roof. So that brings us up to today. So we can hear tenants shouting, hallelujah, because they're bringing in the renters' rights bill. However, one of the unintended consequences of the renters' rights bill is that rents are going to go even higher. So there's loads in the renters' rights bill, which on the face of it looks really, really good for tenants. And there's some really great reforms in there. One of the big changes that's going to be happening in the renters' rights bill is the abolishment of Section 21 eviction notices. Now, a Section 21 eviction notice is something that can be served on a tenant, and a landlord can evict their tenant with no fault on the tenant's part. The Section 21 is a no-fault eviction. The Section 8 is a fault eviction. So the idea is, if we get rid of the Section 21, that will leave Section 8, which means tenants can only be evicted from their property if they are at fault. However, the problem with Section 8 is that it requires the court to intervene, and the landlord has to prove that a tenant has been doing something that's at fault. If it might be the case that a tenant has been doing antisocial behaviour or selling drugs from the landlord's property and the landlord finds out about it, they can serve a Section 21 notice and get those tenants out of their properties quickly. With Section 8 evictions, they're a much longer process because they have to go through court, and it's much more challenging for the landlord to prove fault. How does the landlord prove that people are being antisocial within their properties? How does a landlord prove that people are selling drugs from their properties, right? So what was Section 21 is now being abolished, which was the quick way for landlords to get rid of unscrupulous tenants. They're now going to have to go through this much longer process, and it's going to be a much more expensive process. And what that means is that landlords are feeling worried. They're feeling worried about not being able to evict tenants who are damaging their properties or doing stuff in their properties that they don't want them to do. And because of this, landlords are finding that holding onto their property or having tenants in their property is riskier. And where the risk goes up, rents will go up. Because costs of compliance are going to increase. Costs of administration are going to increase because landlords are going to make sure that they're going to want to make sure that they're on top of all of these changes to ensure that they fulfill all the obligations that they have to fulfill within the renters' rights bill. And this is ultimately going to lead to a lot of landlords putting rents up or selling their properties. And as we've already discussed, if landlords sell their properties, supply drops. Demand is still increasing. And that is going to force rents even higher still. But here's the thing. In every problem, there's an equal or greater opportunity. What is the opportunity here for us as property investors or budding property investors? We have an opportunity here to help a load of people, landlords and tenants, because what we ultimately need in this country is more landlords. Landlords are not the problem. Too few landlords is the problem. Government intervention is the problem. But if we can increase the number of landlords, we can increase the supply. And if we increase the supply to meet demand, then rents can come down. So we need more landlords than ever before. There are some great opportunities coming up, because if you have a landlord who wants to sell their property because they're feeling stressed, you can help that landlord by buying their property and becoming a landlord. You can learn the skills and strategies that you need in order to be compliant with the new Renters' Rights Bill. And we can learn these strategies at Progressive Property Trainings. Because once you know what you're doing and you know how to navigate that bill, you can set up your properties and do win-win deals in such a way that you do not have to shoulder the burden of all of the costs that normal landlords have to shoulder because they haven't had training. Tenants need more landlords because you can help tenants by taking properties on. And you can help them because the more properties, the more landlords there are, the lower rents can become. And so tenants won't be shouldered with the same rent burdens as they're shouldered with. If we can bring rents down by increasing supply, by increasing the number of landlords, then we create win-win situations for everyone. Observe the masses and do the opposite. So we're going to have a mass exodus of landlords from the market in the next few years because of all of these changes that are happening. This will enable you to pick up bargain price properties. This will enable you to structure creative deals with landlords to help solve their problem and get into property and start using properties in such a way that makes a huge amount of money that normal landlords aren't even aware of. And you can help those tenants. It's a huge opportunity coming right now. And if you're not in, you can't win. So here at Progressive, we train thousands of people every single year. We're the UK's largest property education and training company. And if you want to get started and learn more about property, click the link in the description below to start your journey today. I've been Sean Fitzpatrick. Thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to never miss a future upload. See you in the next episode.
You've worked hard your whole life, built savings, maybe even bought property. But when it comes to stocks, you hold back. Because deep down, there's that fear. What if I lose it all? What if it's just another scam? Honestly, day trading probably isn't going to work for you. But investing is different. You're smart enough to know saving alone isn't enough to build the best future for your family. But investing in stocks can feel overwhelming. That's not your fault. School never taught us how to do this. I'm Ben Knight, and over the last decade, I've been investing successfully and consistently in the stock market, and I've taught hundreds of people my step-by-step strategy that takes less than 5 minutes a day. Now, I want to show you how to do this too. That's why I created my free online masterclass. And if you're serious about building wealth for you and your family, you need to be there. Seats fill up fast, so don't miss this. To secure your free space, go right now to www.thetradetribe.com and I'll see you there live.